You already think you know this story. A teenage boy with a rare disease that rebuilt his skull from inside out. A tough-as-nails biker mother in a leather jacket. Cher winning an Oscar for playing her. A Hollywood tearjerker that made America cry in 1985 and then quietly forget the real people underneath it. That's the version everyone remembers. But the woman at the center of that story, Rusty Dennis, spent years after her son's death saying things in print and on camera that never made it into the movie. Things that complicate the neat, feel-good version we've all been sold. Today we're going back through the actual record. Interviews, court fights, medical facts, and the parts of this story Hollywood left on the cutting room floor. Let's start with who Roy Lee Dennis actually was, because the nickname came first and the legend came later. Everybody called him Rocky, and the story behind that nickname is almost too sweet for how hard his life would turn out to be. As a baby, he wouldn't settle down unless somebody rocked him, so the name just stuck. He was born in December of 1961 in Glendora, California, to Florence Rusty Tullis and her second husband, Roy Dennis. In his earliest years, there wasn't anything mysterious going on. He got sick a lot. Ear infections, sinus infections, the kind of thing that makes a mother tired but not terrified. Then, when he was about 2 years old, doctors scheduled a routine tonsillectomy. And during the pre-op work, an X-ray technician noticed something was wrong with the shape of his skull. That single observation kicked off almost a year of trips to UCLA Medical Center, sometimes multiple times a week, before doctors finally had a name for what they were looking at: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. It's hard to overstate how rare this diagnosis was. In the mid-1960s, when Rusty first heard the term, doctors told her that only a handful of cases had ever been documented in the entire history of medicine. The disease causes calcium to build up abnormally in the skull, thickening the bone over time, pushing outward, distorting the face, and slowly crushing the very things that let a person see, hear, and think clearly. The prognosis doctors gave Rusty wasn't gentle. They told her flatly that her son would likely go blind, that he would probably have significant intellectual disability, and that he would not live past the age of 7. Rusty did not take that prognosis quietly. Whatever else you want to say about her, and there's plenty to say, she refused to let a chart full of statistics decide who her son was going to be. While the family lived in the Covina and Glendora area, she pushed back constantly against institutions that wanted to lower expectations for Rocky. When doctors said his vision was too poor for him to learn to read, she pushed him toward books anyway. When schools tried to move him out of regular classrooms and into separate programs, she fought them, insisting that Rocky's intelligence was completely intact and that the real problem was how uncomfortable other people were around his appearance. And by most accounts, Rocky backed up every bit of that fight. Teachers, classmates, and eventually the film's own screenwriter would describe him as funny, warm, and disarmingly self-assured for a kid who had every reason not to be. Here's where it's worth pausing on the woman herself, because Rusty Dennis was never going to fit neatly into anyone's idea of a Hollywood mom. She was born Florence Steinberg in Brooklyn in 1936, the daughter of a truck driver, raised Jewish, and famously sharp-tongued from an early age. She was expelled from junior high for skipping school at 13. By 14, she was smoking marijuana and running with motorcycle crews. By 15, she dropped out of school entirely and was working as a dancer at Coney Island, before she was even old enough to legally drive. She married young, had a son named Joshua from that first marriage, watched it collapse, moved back in with her parents for a while, married again, this time to Roy Dennis, and eventually landed in California, where Rocky was born in 1961. By the time doctors handed her that grim prognosis, Rusty had already built her entire worldview around one core belief, that if a person could make themselves sick through sheer force of mind, they could also make themselves well the same way. She applied that philosophy to Rocky relentlessly. Every headache, every flare-up of pain, her answer was the same: send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. It's a philosophy that's easy to admire from a distance, because it clearly gave Rocky a kind of armor against self-pity. It's also a philosophy that's fair to question, because willpower was never actually going to stop a bone disease, and we'll come back to exactly why that distinction matters later. The movie touched on Rusty's world, but sanded down a lot of its rough edges. She wasn't just hanging around bikers for atmosphere. She was a full member of the Turks Motorcycle Club, a real crew built around loyalty, hard living, and a blunt, physical kind of love that doesn't photograph as polished as a movie needs it to. The character Gar, played by Sam Elliott in the film, was based on Rusty's real partner, a man named Bernie Tullis. That entire biker circle wasn't set dressing for a gritty aesthetic. It was Rocky's actual extended family, the people who showed up for him without blinking at his face. And Rusty was refreshingly blunt about her own drug use in a way the film never quite captured. The movie leans into the idea that she used because she was overwhelmed, drowning under the weight of raising a dying child. Rusty rejected that framing outright. In interviews, she said plainly that she partied constantly and that drugs were simply part of that lifestyle, not a symptom of despair, not a coping mechanism she was ashamed of, just a fact about who she was. That distinction mattered enormously to her, because it meant refusing to let anyone turn her into a tragic figure just because her son was dying. So what happened when the cameras actually came looking for her reaction to the film? Because this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable. Mask hit theaters in 1985, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, with Cher playing Rusty and Eric Stoltz playing Rocky under heavy prosthetic makeup. It made more than $48 million at the box office. Rusty herself was paid $15,000 for the rights to her family story. Sit with that gap for a second. $48 million generated by a true story, and $15,000 going to the actual mother who lived it. What makes that number even harder to sit with is where most of it reportedly went. Not into anything for herself, but toward medical bills for her older son, Joshua, who was being treated for AIDS-related illness at the time. She didn't sell her dead son's story for a payday. She sold it to try to keep her other son alive. When reporters came calling expecting gratitude and maybe some tears, Rusty gave them something much more interesting. She called the movie a fairy tale. Not a tribute, not a loving memorial, a fairy tale. In a widely cited 1986 Chicago Tribune profile, she explained that she'd hoped the film would highlight Rocky's courage for the benefit of disabled kids and their parents, and admitted she hadn't expected the story to become just as much about her. She noted, with a kind of wry self-awareness, that thanks to Cher's performance, she came across looking like something of a heroine. Reading that closely, she wasn't bitter about Cher at all. She actually praised the performance. What clearly bothered her was the shift in focus. Watching a film meant to honor her son's courage turn into a showcase for a glamorous, complicated version of herself. She was, in fact, unusually generous about Cher specifically. In that same interview, she said Cher had captured the way she really was, and added that she'd always considered herself perfectly normal. It was the rest of the world that was nuts. That line alone tells you almost everything you need to know about Rusty Dennis's worldview. The Chicago Tribune piece also nailed down the two biggest factual liberties Rusty herself flagged. First, the film compressed well over a decade of real events into what looks like roughly a single year on screen. Second, and this one clearly stung, her older son Joshua doesn't appear anywhere in the film. He was simply written out of his own brother's story entirely. Then there's the music, which turned into its own small saga. Rocky was a devoted Bruce Springsteen fan, and Bogdanovich built the film's entire intended soundtrack around Springsteen's music. But Universal Pictures couldn't close a licensing deal with Springsteen's label, Columbia Records, and swapped in Bob Seger tracks instead, reportedly without even telling Bogdanovich until it was done. Rusty was not shy about her opinion. On a 1985 San Francisco talk show, she said flatly that she didn't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. It's a short line, but it lands like a gut punch, because it's really about a studio erasing one more piece of who her son actually was. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal for $19 million over the switch, and the Springsteen songs were finally restored nearly 2 decades later, for the 2004 director's cut. Now here's the part of the story that rarely gets discussed with any nuance at all: the night Rocky actually died. By September of 1978, his health had collapsed sharply. He was 16 years old, using a wheelchair in his final weeks, and the headaches that had shadowed him his entire life had become something nothing could touch. The family went out for dinner that night, Rocky, Rusty, and the extended biker family around them. and everyone could see how weak he'd become. He came home with a headache. Rusty responded the way she always had. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Rocky died the next morning, at 16, nearly 17, having outlived a death sentence doctors handed his mother almost a decade earlier. The film shows Rusty discovering his body herself, a scene built for maximum emotional devastation. In reality, she wasn't even home when it happened. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge, and it was Bernie, the real Gar, who called to tell her. That gap between the movie's version and what actually happened doesn't make Rusty a villain. But it does say something about how much smoothing Hollywood does to an already jagged, complicated story before it's ready for a wide audience. It's worth being careful here, because Rusty never publicly described her make-yourself-well philosophy as a mistake, and she never framed Rocky's death as something she felt guilty about. Putting those words in her mouth would be dishonest. What she did say, consistently and without flinching, was that she believed in that philosophy completely, right up to the end. Whether it also meant that Rocky's pain sometimes got minimized along the way is something only the two of them ever really knew. What the record does show is that she never walked it back, never apologized for it, and always maintained that it gave her son something rare, the refusal to think of himself as a boy who was dying. To really understand Rusty, you also have to understand Joshua, because the film erased him, and that erasure clearly wounded her. Joshua was working as a writer in San Francisco in 1985 when a year later he was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, the cancer closely associated with the AIDS crisis of that era. He was openly gay, and by Rusty's own account, she was supportive of him, even if she'd once hoped for grandchildren and floated the idea of a sperm bank. Joshua died in 1987 at 32. Rusty had now buried both of her sons. Most of that $15,000 payment from the film, according to reporting at the time, had gone toward Joshua's medical bills, meaning she'd sold one son's story in an attempt to help save the other, and it still wasn't enough. In one interview, she said simply that Joshua didn't believe in dying, and neither did she. After Rocky's death, Rusty moved to San Francisco, took up Buddhism, and started working as a counselor helping people struggling with addiction. Around the time the film came out, she had plans to work with the Shawnee Project, an organization supporting terminally ill patients, including many with AIDS. The woman, once defined entirely by chaos, was, by the mid-1980s, quietly building something steadier, though she never fully gave up her old life either. She kept riding motorcycles until the very end. That end came in October of 2006. Rusty, by then going by her birth name, Florence Tullis, was riding her three-wheeled motorcycle when the right tire came off. She lost control, the bike hit a curb, and her body slammed into a telephone pole. What makes the aftermath so hard to read is that nobody even knew at first. Friends and family only found out after a small item ran in a local newspaper about an unidentified 70-year-old woman injured in a motorcycle accident. Someone connected the dots and went to find her. She'd broken both legs and punctured a lung, and true to form, she survived the crash itself. It was the infection that followed that she couldn't fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at 70 years old. She never stopped being exactly who she'd always been. She once said that Rocky's death was just another place to go, and that he'd always loved going places. She said the same thing about death that she said about Joshua, that she simply didn't believe in it. She never once asked, why me? Not for Rocky, not for Joshua, not for herself. A 1986 profile described her as a middle-aged Jewish mother, former addict, former go-go dancer, and product distributor, living in a spotlessly clean biker crash pad in San Francisco's Mission District with a nephew and 3 biker roommates. It's one of the strangest, most vivid character sketches in American journalism, and somehow it explains her completely. So what's the actual takeaway once you strip away the Hollywood gloss? Rocky Dennis lived 16 years with a disease that was supposed to kill him before he learned to read, and he did it with humor, curiosity, and a flat refusal to be defined by his appearance. He graduated junior high as an honor student after starting out academically behind. He was voted friendliest camper and most good-natured at summer camp. He tutored other kids for money and negotiated his own rate. He fell for a blind girl who couldn't see his face and loved everything else about him. When offered surgery to reshape his features, he reportedly asked who he'd even see in the mirror afterward, and chose to keep his own face exactly as it was. His mother was a Brooklyn-born biker with a drug habit, a truancy record, and an unshakable conviction that the world was more broken than her son ever was. She fought principals who tried to sideline him. She fought doctors who tried to box him into a timeline. She surrounded him with a rough, loyal family who loved him without conditions. And she told him every single day that he was not a victim. And yes, on the very last night of his life, she told him to go to his room and make himself well just like she always had, because she believed in it completely, right to the end. The film's own screenwriter, Anna Hamilton Phelan, put about as well as anyone ever has. Rusty was never going to be PDA Mother of the Year, but she was exactly the mother Rocky needed. Whether you hear that as praise, as a complication, or as both at once, is entirely up to you. Rocky died at home, in his sleep, without machines and without a hospital, a promise his mother made him and somehow kept. Rusty died in 2006, still moving, still unwilling to stop, right up until the moment she had no choice. If you were expecting a clean, redemptive ending here, Rusty Dennis was never going to give you one. What she left behind instead was something messier and far more honest, the truth, in all its complication, finally on the record.